we're continuing with, if the first day was to lay out the major schematic systems that language has for structuring conceptual material, and the second day looked at one of those systems. It elaborated on one of the systems, namely the configurational structure system. Then today, both talks today are going to elaborate on another of those systems, the attention system. What I remember that some of the major schematic systems were configurational structure, location of perspective point, distribution of attention. So that's today. And there's also, and force dynamics, which we did, and something else, some other things. So today it's going to be attention and consciousness. And the basic perspective is that in any given speech situation, let's say you've got a hearer, hears the sounds of the speaker and can interpret from them the conceptual content that those sounds represent, and the hearer can be can attend to the context that surrounds everything. But typically, I mean, it's essentially impossible for all of that, all of those domains, the phonological expression, the meaning, and the context, to be uniformly in the foreground of the hearer's attention. Inevitably, some portions or aspects of these domains are going to be more salient, while others are going to be less salient. And not all of this is simply due to an inherent interest value of some items over others. On the contrary, there's an extensive system in language which is devoted to allocating attention. It is a system for designating that the hearer should delegate more attention to this and less to that in some systematic way. And in fact, I've got something like over 50 factors, 50 attentional factors that language uses, which fall into some 10 different groupings. And each factor either raises or lowers, or both, attention on some aspect of the expression, the meaning of the context, and directs the hearer to allocate his attention accordingly. Some of these factors, typically the speaker can use intentionally, or at least can decide which aspects to foreground and which to background, and can use these factors in order to do that. And in that case, what happens in the hearer is the hearer detects these mechanisms, these linguistic devices for allocating attention, and the hearer develops his mental image accordingly, with some parts raised in attention, other parts backgrounded in attention. So that's the basic layout. And okay, so one thing is the methodology used in studying attention. I mean, how do you study attention? Well, my methodology is always introspection, where you actually watch how language behaves within yourself. That's the nature of introspection. And you catch whether or not some things seem more salient than others. So it's introspection in combination with the normal forms of linguistic analysis, comparison and contrast, and so forth. And the second talk today will address this whole use of introspection. It's not, many people question whether it's legitimate to use introspection as a methodology for acquiring information about the nature of language. And instead, there's a general move towards so-called, this is a gesture in America for quotes, quote marks, so-called more objective methodologies. But the whole second talk justifies the use of introspection and in fact says it's inevitable, you have to, language can't exist without introspection, even among ordinary speakers. So I will leave that justification until this afternoon. And accordingly, I'm going to skip most of the introductory portion that's on the current handout, most of section 1. But I'll just say a few things just to orient you. First, I'm concurrently addressing both attention and consciousness. To me, they are made of the same stuff. They're not two different things. There's one thing, there's consciousness. And, but there's a number of different parameters. I list a set of parameters there, including strength of something, whether something is conscious or unconscious, whether something is constant or shifting. There's a range of parameters that affect the nature of the content of consciousness and its behavior. And you can regard attention as simply consciousness with a certain set of qualifiers. In particular, attention is consciousness where you have volitional, intentional, you can volitionally or intentionally direct your consciousness at something. That would be attention. And where it's more focused, consciousness does not have to be focused, but attention does. And so there are several systematic ways in terms of these basic parameters, this kind of grid that qualifies the domain of consciousness. For certain values of those parameters, that's what attention is. So it's just consciousness with a certain set of parameter values. But otherwise, it's the same stuff. There aren't two things there. Let's see, is that all I want to say about that? Oh yeah, and just accordingly, there's some terminology. And these will then therefore be all will be equivalent. First of all, I regard some psychological systems assume that attention or consciousness, except consciousness is only now starting to be used as a term in psychology. It's usually been taboo, and attention has been in there instead. But in any case, some forms of psychology think that it's an all or none phenomenon. Either you have attention or you don't. But the evidence from language is that it's a gradient phenomenon. So accordingly, there's terminology which will show this gradients. So you can say things like something's in the foreground of attention or in the background of attention, or is high in attention or low in attention. And if you use the word consciousness, typically in English you would say it's in the center of consciousness or in the periphery of consciousness. And the word salient is equally used. You could say something's either more salient or less salient. Salient means prominent, stands out. So these will all be interchangeable terms for me. They all refer to one of the parameters that applies across the board to attention, consciousness, and salience, namely its strength, how strong it is. And the strength is gradient. Okay, so I think instead of dwelling longer on, I should say that of these factors that I've got, these 50-some factors, they vary in along certain other parameters, certain characteristics, but I think it would be easier just to give you a flavor of it, to just dive right in and start with the examples. So the factors group into certain categories. And the first category is attentional factors that pertain to the morpheme. And by morpheme, I use an extended sense of morpheme, not only a simplex morpheme, like just a word like cat, but also an idiom is a morpheme for me, as well as a construction that has its own minimally associated meaning with it, and so forth. I call those morphemes. So let me go to the very first factor, factor AA1, And the factors that I'm going to talk about have a little star, an asterisk in front of them. We saw this example in the very first talk, but now I'm going to talk about something else. This is the relevance of a morpheme's lexical category on its attentional, on its salience. In general, the principle is, if a morpheme is in an open class category, it's more salient than if it's a closed class category. And the same concept is going to be more salient if it's expressed by an open class morpheme than by a closed class morpheme. The last time we saw this very example, what I was stressing then was that when a concept is expressed in an open class morpheme, its function is to represent conceptual content. Whereas when it's represented by a closed class morpheme, its function is to express conceptual structure. In this case, I'm not dealing with the content versus structure distinction, I'm dealing with salience. And the same concept is simply more salient in the open class form than in the closed class form. So here's the same example with past tense and future tense. And the past tense, when it's represented by a closed class form, like ed, like when he arrived, or the future, when he arrives, or when he will arrive, is comparatively backgrounded in attentional value. It doesn't hit you in the face about its conceptual content, but it's about its concept that it represents. But as soon as you're representing the same concept with an open class form, as in on his previous arrival, or for the past, or on his upcoming arrival, all of a sudden that concept of relative past time, meaning occurring before the present moment, or occurring after the present moment, is now foregrounded. It's by virtue of being expressed within an open class form, it's foregrounded there. So the very same concept has two different levels of salience. Salience means, how much attention it attracts to itself from the hearer or from the speaker, and it's built into the fabric of the language. It's automatic. That if it's in a closed class form, it's automatically going to be more backgrounded, in an open class form, more foregrounded. And so this is under the category of properties of the morpheme that I call formal properties of the morpheme. Okay, so moving on. The next formal, within the category of formal properties of the morpheme, is the degree of morphological autonomy. So a morpheme can be either bound or free. If it's bound, it's an affix of some sort. And in general, the attentional factor seems to be that the same concept is more salient if it's expressed by a morpheme that's free than if it's expressed by a bound morpheme. So here are some examples. And then again, in order to see this, you have to use your introspection to find whether you agree with it or not. I mean, you may not agree, but in any case, introspection is going to be the methodology you have to use to see if you do agree. So first, this takes place both within closed class forms and an open class form. Closed class forms can be either bound or free, and open class forms can be either bound or free. So let's start with closed class forms. You can say this kind of trap cannot be set again. Or you can say this kind of trap is unresettable. Okay? So these two forms cannot be set again. Can is a closed class form. It's a modal. Not is a particle. It's a closed class. It's a free form. Again is a closed class form. B is a closed class form. So here we've got the concepts of can expresses some kind of potential notion. The not expresses negative. The B expresses some kind of backgrounding of the agency. It makes it a passive voice. And the again is some kind of the iteration concept. Okay, the same exact four concepts show up as bound closed class forms. These were free closed class forms. They show up as bound closed class forms in the word unresettable. But I think that they are backgrounded there relative to the situation where they are free. So unresettable, the un means negative, the re means iteration. The able means both the passive and the potential. But it seems to me that the very same concepts are of potential, negation, and so forth are relatively backgrounded. Okay, we find the exact same situation with open class forms. So here let's take the word to ship. To ship is a verb, and so is it's a free verb. But there's also a bound verbal morpheme, port, which typically doesn't appear by itself. It has to be prefixed. But both of them mean to move large bulky objects over geographic distances. So you can ship cargo or ship things in, you can ship them out, you can ship them away, you can ship them across, and so forth. However, you've got with port, which pretty much means the same thing, you've got forms like import, export, deport, transport. They mean very similar things, but in to my introspection, the word port is the morpheme port is relatively backgrounded by comparison to ship. It's in fact hard to even identify that the port has the specific meaning that it does. It's hard to pull it out from the whole word. I would say that even the same meaning is the same concept shows two different degrees of salience depending on this formal property that it has, whether it's unbound or bound. So, and here we've seen it for a free morpheme. We just saw it for a bound morpheme, the same kind of phenomenon. Okay, that's all within the category of formal properties of the morpheme. Now let's go to another category, which are the componential properties of the morpheme. And we'll go to factor AB1. The idea here is that, let's take a concept. There's a concept. A particular concept can sometimes be the entire content of the whole morpheme. In other cases, here's another whole morpheme. It can be just a portion of that morpheme's meaning, this particular concept, and it's joined in that morpheme's meaning by other concepts. And the factor here is that when a particular concept is the only concept occupying the meaning of a morpheme, it takes up the full share of a morpheme's meaning, it's more salient than when it occupies only some portion of the morpheme's whole meaning. So what are some examples? Well, let's take the concept of parent, or the concept of sister. Well, let's stick with parent. No, let's stick with sister. Let's stick with sister. Here's a phrase. One of my parents' sisters is sick. So the concept of sister, I'm going to compare the concept of sister with the morpheme sister. So there's a concept and there's the morpheme sister. The morpheme sister, its meaning, consists only of the concept sister. The concept of a female sibling. That's all it has. So, fine. So here's a case where the concept of sister occupies the entirety of the morpheme sister, S-I-S-T-E-R. Now, let's compare another phrase. One of my aunts is sick. A-U-N-T. An aunt is a parent's sister. Well, there's one exception, but let's just say where it is. It can mean a parent's sister. So now, what is an aunt? An aunt, as a morpheme, includes the concept of parent and sister within it. Here's the morpheme. Here's the concept of a parent and that parent's sister. The two concepts are inside the one morpheme. So sister, the concept of sister, is still in that morpheme. It's in that morpheme, aunt. But it's only one of the concepts there. It only occupies a portion of the morpheme's total meaning. And my impression is that because of that, the concept of sister is less salient as a concept than the concept sister is when it's expressed by the word sister. So if I say to you, one of my aunts is sick, the concept of sisterhood might take a little longer for it to strike your consciousness than if I said one of my parents' sisters, where I use the word sister itself. Oh, eat and swallow. Yeah. We find the same thing with eat and swallow. If you consider the concept of swallowing, swallowing is when you, just this portion when the food goes down from your mouth down into your throat. That's swallowing. That concept of swallowing occupies the totality of the morpheme, the verb to swallow. See, we've had a noun before, now we're going to have a verb. But in eat, it's only a portion of it. Eat demands, the meaning of the verb to eat includes the notion of swallowing. It has to, in fact, happen. But it includes more. It typically includes putting it, inserting it into the mouth and chewing, as well as swallowing. But so swallow is just one portion of the total set of concepts within eat. And I would say that, in fact, swallow, as a concept, even though it's necessarily present in eat, you haven't eaten something unless you've swallowed it. And if you take a piece of meat, put it in your mouth and chew it and then spit it out, you cannot say, I ate the piece of meat. You have to have swallowed it. But I would say that the concept of swallowing, even though it's necessary to eat, is less salient there than it is when it occupies the totality of the verb to swallow. Okay? So this is now the principle of the share of a morpheme's total meaning that is occupied by a concept. The principle is a concept is more salient, it attracts more attention, more of your attention is on it, if it occupies the totality than if it occupies just a portion of a morpheme's total meaning. Okay, well that's one of the componential properties of the morpheme. We're going to have three here. Let's go on to the second one. The second one is the ensemble versus the individual components of a morpheme. So now we're going to deal solely with the case, not like a verb like swallow, but we're going to deal solely with verbs like eat or nouns like aunt, which intrinsically already contain several different concepts. So we're just dealing with morphemes which already have a number of concepts within them. And here's the attentional principle. More attention is on the totality, on the ensemble, on the gestalt, on the accumulation of all those concepts together than on the set of individual concepts that make up that ensemble. So I'll give you some example of that. Let's take the verb to pry in English. Not everybody knows this verb, but I'll explain it. All right. Well, I actually don't need to draw anything. I'll just demonstrate. Let's say here's a wall, and here's a board on the wall there. Just to let you know already, to pry a board off the wall, means it's nailed there, and you take a crowbar and you go, and it comes off. That's pry a board off the wall. Okay? So the question is, what are the components within pry? What do you have to have present in the total situation in order to be able to say, I pried the board off the wall? Well, let's go look. Let's do an analysis. Let's say that what I have is, first, a board that's somehow stuck to the wall. There's a handle here. There's a handle on the board. And I pull the handle, and I get board off the wall. In English, you cannot, in this circumstance, say, I pried the board off the wall. All that you can say is, I pulled the board off the wall. So what's the reason? Well, it turns out that for pry to work, to be usable, it demands a particular component. A component that the mechanism for separating the figure object from the ground object is that something acts between them. Some kind of lever pulling them apart. Okay, so now we know that that's one component within the verb to pry. You draw pry here. One component, number one, lever between the figure and the ground, forcing them apart. Or pushing them apart. Okay, fine. So is that the only component necessary for pry? No. Let's say we now have, here's the wall, we now have a board, and it's not glued to the wall, but it has like a screw. It's a screw-based, or not screw, but a hinge. It's got a hinge here. And I take my crowbar, stick it between, and I go like that. And it just comes off. In this case, so now I do have the component of pushing between the figure and the ground, but I still, in English, you still cannot say, I pried the board off the wall. Something extra is necessary. Namely, it has to be stuck to the wall. And offer resistance. You have to force the figure away from the ground. You wouldn't say, I pried the board off the wall. You'd say, I flipped the board off the wall. Oh, let's flip. Okay, so is that enough? Well, no. Let's now say, here's the wall. Let's say I have a board. And let's say it's okay, it's glued. It's stuck to the wall. And I take my crowbar. I am going between. So I've got both of the preceding components in place, in-betweenness, stuckness, and they go like that, and it comes off all at once. You still cannot say, I pried the board off the wall. Now you have to say something like, I popped the board off the wall. So what's going on? Well, it turns out that pry needs, in addition, a concept of gradualness, progressiveness. It has to gradually come off until it finally comes off. It can't come off all at once. So we've now got a third component in pry, namely gradual departure, separation. Is that enough? No. Let's say instead of a board now we have a large piece of masking tape, stuck to the wall. So it's stuck. Let's say I take my I take my lever, stick it between the tape and the wall, and I go like this, and I pull the masking tape down. So I am between. It is stuck. It is gradual, but you still wouldn't say I pried the masking tape off the wall. You would say I peeled the masking tape off the wall. So what's missing now? Well, you need one more component for pry, and that is the figure has to be semi-rigid. It can't be flexible. So like a board, it has to be semi-rigid, but it has to be only semi-rigid, not totally rigid, in order for you to have enough flexibility to come off gradually. Okay, so all of that is in the verb to pry. If I were talking to an English audience who knows the verb to pry, I would then ask them, did you know that? I would ask, did you know everything about all those components? And the answer, of course, is no. Somewhere in your cognition, these components must exist because everybody knows how to use the verb to pry. They know all these things. In any of these alternative situations, they would know, some part of their cognition registers that you can't say pry, you'd have to use some other verb. So somewhere that knowledge, in quotes, is not necessarily conscious, is there. But it's not conscious or readily conscious or easily availably conscious knowledge. So the upshot of this, that's where this factor of salience comes in. What is salient is how all of these components together can join together as a kind of ensemble, a togetherness, that can be quite salient. If you tell anybody the verb to try, they automatically have a gestalt image of what it means if they can readily construct it. So that part is salient. But what is backgrounded is the individual components that are part of this total gestalt conceptual complex. So that's this principle of salience. It's the whole versus the parts, basically. The whole is more salient than the parts, to put it in Gestalt terms. And I should point out that some of these components can be extremely unconscious. So, for example, I have given this example to my class a number of times. And then I talked about it to a colleague of mine, Karen Michelson, who came up with the masking tape example, which hadn't occurred to me. Embedded in in one's unconscious expectations is the component of partial rigidity of the figure that I hadn't ferreted it out. I hadn't been able to isolate it and pull it out. She did. So it's an index of how inaccessible to consciousness some of these semantic components can be. Okay. The next factor is a third factor within the componential attentional properties of the morpheme. And that is that there can be, again, we're with morphemes that have multiple concepts within them, there can be a weighting, that's spelled W-E-I-G-H-T, a weighting among the concepts relative to each other. So some can be more salient than others. Even though they all belong to the same morpheme, they all have to be present, they can still be weighted. So within tri, for example, and this very thing is an example of it, I would say that of the various components, I showed that they're all necessary. So it's not dependent on necessity of these components. It's an independent observation that they have separate weighting. It seems to be that the most salient among the components is the leverage effect, the notion of sticking in something between the objects. That's the most salient. The least salient is this semi-rigidity of the figure. Remember, I barely thought of it at all. I didn't think of it at all. So those have salience differences. Similarly is the case with eat and swallow. With the concept within eat, the concept of swallowing is rather backgrounded in salience. In fact, it seems to be that it's less salient than chewing, as evidenced by the fact that when you say things like eat faster or you should eat carefully, it seems to be that, well, the adverbs seem to be applying to the chewing component rather than to the swallowing component. You can't swallow faster, you can't swallow carefully, I suppose. But this fact is despite the fact that swallowing is in fact criterial to eating. And here's what I mean by criteria. You can tell of a set of components that are in a morpheme. You can tell which one is criterial by what I call the almost test. It seems like the almost, like if you use almost, it isolates out. It first negates The most crucial part of the core component of a verb's meaning, of a word's meaning, and you're free to, it at least negates that, and you're free to successively negate some more components beyond it. But the crucial one is always the one, the criteria one. So swallowing turns out to be criterial or crucial by that test. So for example, if you say, I almost ate the piece of meat, you could have done everything with the meat except swallow it. It means at least you didn't swallow it. Maybe you also didn't chew it. If you say, I almost ate the piece of meat. Maybe it means you didn't even insert it into your mouth. Maybe it means you didn't even pick it up off the plate. Those are extras, but it at least means you didn't swallow it. So by the almost test, swallowing is criterial to the meaning of eat. Nevertheless, curiously, in fact, it's not, that doesn't translate into salience. It seems like another component, the chewing component, strikes me as more salient than the eating component. I don't know how you would test that. I'm not certain about that, but in any case, it's pretty salient. And I suspect the eating part, the swallowing part, is less so. Now, you might assume that, one might expect that if two morphemes, you could go look for cases where two morphemes would have the same set of component meanings inside them, but differ only with respect to their relative weighting, their relative salience. And sure enough, I think there could be an example of this. This would be the same verb. The verb I'm choosing is to pass, as in the diners pass the goblet of wine around the banquet table. In two of its forms. One is in its agentive form, the one I gave you, and the other is in its intransitive form, the goblet of wine slowly passed around the banquet table. Now, in my analysis, the verb to pass, both verbs to pass, the transitive one and the intransitive one, both have the same components. They both have the notion, the core notion of handing something, an object going from one person's hand into the hand of another person. So they both got both that, and they also both have agency. It's got to be done by some volitional agent doing this transfer. So it's got both components. The difference is, though, that this concept, this component of agency, so here's intransitive pass, it's got agency and hand-to-hand. Here's transitive pass, it's got agency and hand-to-hand. But the agency in this one is more salient is very salient, is more salient than this agency is. In fact, this agency is probably less salient than the hand-to-hand concept. So in fact, if you say the goblet of wine slowly passed around the banquet table, it is lexicalized within the verb to pass that there is agency, volitional agency. It's part of the actual meaning of the verb. It's a component of the meaning of the verb, but it's much more reduced in salience in that verb when it's transitive. And how do we know that it's there at all and not just inferred by the context? Because you can contrast it with the third sentence in that example. The goblet of wine slowly went around the banquet table. Go absolutely lacks any lexicalized concept of agency within it. It solely refers to the goblet's motion. So if you understand that sentence to refer to people agentively passing the goblet around, it's done solely by your adding in that information through context. In other words, it's pragmatic. Whereas with intransitive pass, it's semantic. It's actually lexicalized within the verb. The verb itself automatically has the notion of agency within it. That's the difference in meaning between the goblet slowly passed around, the goblet slowly went around. So in effect, intransitive pass and go are as if they were the bookends around the threshold difference between semantics and pragmatics. They mark the distinction between semantics and pragmatics. The concept of agency is semantic or lexical within pass, and it's pragmatic if you read it in for go. So, and now there's a diagram there. I won't go over it here with you, but this diagram combines the findings that we've had for all three of these componential attentional factors of the morpheme into one fell swoop. So you can look at that diagram yourself. Good. AC1. Factor AC1, which is on page 77. So we're going to skip now to this next starred factor, factor AC1, on page 77. Okay, so this pertains to frame properties of the morpheme, not componential properties, but frame properties of the morpheme. And in particular, in this, all I'm going to cover is this first factor. It distinguishes what I now call, I think I called it the direct meaning. I call it the core meaning versus the associated meaning of a morpheme. And the basic principle is that the core meaning of a morpheme is more salient than the associated meaning of a morpheme. And there are three kinds of associated meaning here that are illustrated in this handout. The first kind, so the core meaning is essentially the difference between denotation and connotation. The first kind of associated meaning here, I call, I call it now the augment. I don't know what I called it. It's basically incidental to the core meaning. It can be omitted, it can be altered, it could inherently have been other than otherwise. So that's its character. And so let me give you an example of that. Consider the two morphemes in English, north and east. So let's say I went north, I went east. And if I asked you to tell me what's different about north and east, well, the first thing you would say is the compass orientation. That's true. Is there anything else different about it? Think about it. Is there anything else different about it? Okay, so let's see if we can figure out if anything else is different about them. Now let's say I flew north, I flew east. Okay, how about I kept flying north, I kept flying east. It turns out that if you say I kept flying east, here's the planet, you can do it forever, keep flying east. But if you keep flying north, you can only fly north until you hit the North Pole. Then if you continue, you're now flying south. So it turns out that north has a factor that's different from east, other than the compass orientation, namely that it has the concept of a polar terminus in it. It stopped at the North Pole, going in that direction. I would say that element, its boundedness, the boundedness of north as against the unboundedness of east, is a relatively backgrounded factor. I'd say that is part of its associated meaning. The core meaning is the compass orientation. The associated meaning, in this case, part of what I call the augment, the incidental part, is its boundedness versus unbounded. And okay, so now why do I put this bounded versus unbounded in this type of associated meaning, the incidental type? because it can be omitted, or it could have been otherwise, and still not much would have changed for the core. So, for example, in everyday usage, if your perspective is not that of the global Earth, but just walking around everything, in fact, north and east are comparable. You don't have to think about stopping at the North Pole. So you do drop it for local terrestrial geography. Secondly, it's a convention built in by geographers. It did not have to be this way. So it could have been at the outset of global geography that here's the globe. We could have set up the convention that here's the Western Hemisphere, let's say. I'm going north, I'm going north, I'm going north. Here's the North Pole, and I'm still going north. So we could have designated it that north refers to continuous motion going in that direction around the great circle, which is upward towards the North Pole in the Western Hemisphere, towards the South Pole in the Southern Hemisphere, in the Eastern Hemisphere. So, and then this would have been going south. We could have defined it that way. Comparably, you could have redefined east and west. Here's east and west. This is what, so as of now, this is always east. But we could have set the is it the prime meridian or whatever the time zone is 0 in London, or where is it? Anyway, where the 0 meridian is. We could say going this way is east, going this way is east, but going that way is west. Could have defined it that way, so that if a satellite flies around the Earth, it's going east, west, so forth. It would have been easy to define things that way, but we didn't. So because of this incidental nature or contingent nature of this associated of these associations that we have with the meanings of north and of east, I considered part of this sort of tangential augment kind of meaning. Okay, now let's move on to the another kind of associated meaning, which is what I call co-entailment, the co-entailment stuff. And there's some linguistic tradition for dealing with this. Fillmore, a set of co-entailed concepts is if you have one of them, then you have all of the rest of them. They co-entail each other. So if you've got buying, you've also got selling, and you've also got money. So you can direct your attention to any one component of it, but if you've got any component, you've got the whole thing. So so they're all co-entailed. Well, and then what's in focus in any given verb, in any given word, like to buy, only certain portions of this co-entailed situation, set of elements, is in the core meaning of the verb, and the rest, all the co-entailed things are in the associated meaning. In this case, in the co-entailment portion. And Fillmore called a co-entailed set, he called it a frame, and he called the portion that you have your attention on, he called it highlighted. And Leonard used different terms for this. He uses the term base for the co-entailment set, and the term profile for the portion within it that you have your attention on. So Leonard's example of this, or one of his examples, is hypotenuse, which, here's a right triangle, here's the hypotenuse, and the word hypotenuse automatically brings, even though that line is in the foreground of your attention, therefore it's in my terms, this is now in my framework, is it the core meaning of the noun hypotenuse, in the associated meaning, in this co-entailment portion of the co-entailment of the associated meaning, is the whole right triangle, the whole co-entailed thing. So, and what I can add to what Fillmore and Leonard did in this regard is notice that you can subdivide co-entailment into three types. One is where the focused on object, the thing in the core, it must be co-present with the co-entailed parts in both space and time in a particular relationship. That's in this case. So the hypotenuse must be co-present with the rest of the right triangle in both space and time in order for it to be a hypotenuse. If it's not, then it's not a hypotenuse anymore. Now it's just a line segment. Okay? On another type, the focused on component of a co-entailment set, the one that's in the core meaning, must be co-present in time, but not necessarily in space. So Husserl actually did a lot of this, the German philosopher, did a lot of this kind of stuff before any of us. And his example in his dependency theory, and one of the examples of his is wife and husband. So the word wife is part of a co-entailment set of a married couple. And in this case, the woman of the co-entailment set is in the foreground of attention, is the more salient, and is therefore in the core meaning. And the whole thing is in, or the husband alone is in the background, in the associative meaning. And again, in this case, the foregrounded person has to be co-present with the remainder in time, certainly not in space, because the husband and wife can be in different parts. They don't have to be together. But they have to be co-present in time, because if the husband is dead, then the woman is no longer a wife, but she's a widow. So, so that word at least requires that much in addition. Then if you move on to Fillmore's commercial scene, which is a co-entailment set, as I said, if you you take the verb to buy, its components can be decoupled from the remainder of the co-entailed set of components in both space and time. So therefore, you can say things like, even though they're still all co-entailed, nevertheless, they don't have to be co-present. So you can say things like, I bought her old banjo from her over the phone. So I'm using the verb to buy, so it's okay to use the verb to buy. She'll ship it to me next week, and I'll send her a check for it after it arrives. So the receipt of the goods can come later, and the sending of the money can come still later, and that's okay. You can still use the verb to buy in English. So the verb to buy is still linked with these, the elements of to buy, the buyer and the seller and so forth, or the buyer and the object. They're still linked to all the components within the co-entailment set, but they don't have to be co-present in space and time. So now let me move on to a third kind of associated meaning, what I call the presupposition kind of associated meaning. In this kind, remember the attentional issue in all of these is that the core meaning, the direct meaning, is more salient than the associated meaning. So that's this whole thing is just laying out details of this one single attentional factor. The core is more salient than the association. And in each of these cases, I'm subdividing it by further distinctions, but the same attentional principle holds across all of this stuff. So, so now the presupposition type, let's take, it turns out that any given morpheme often has, in its meaning, its meaning rests upon a set of presupposed concepts and concepts in a particular relationship. It has a whole infrastructure, a conceptual. It can have a whole conceptual infrastructure, which can extend as wide as the whole culture and a set of assumptions, and a sea of this amount of mental presupposition. So let's take, to demonstrate this, let's take a verb like the English verb heaven. It presupposes a whole set of concepts, and I've enumerated them. And here I'm using the word heaven pretty much as it's used in the generalized U.S. general Christian context. First of all, here is presupposed. Every human being has an intangible spirit that what it represents is okay. So the human being has an intangible essence that comprises the sum of his or her identity, and that's generally known as his spirit. That's first presupposition. Second presupposition. This spirit survives or continues after death or despite death, and does not become embodied again. Remember, for each of these presuppositions, there are religions or spiritual systems in the world that if you change it, you've got some other spiritual system. So there's some spiritual systems where a human being has 5 elements that would be called spirit, not just one, and so forth. And here we've got one that says it continues after death and doesn't enter a body. We're going to talk about heaven. We're not going to talk about reincarnation, whose intentions determine everything in the universe. Okay, so there's this concept of a all-determining entity, sentient entity. So God has established a certain set of ideal principles that He wants humans to act in accordance with. And I'll just read it from here. He rewards those who follow these precepts, and He punishes those who don't follow these precepts. And there are further particulars, presuppositions in this list, such as that even though God is ubiquitous, is everywhere, in principle, nevertheless, He can be imagined as located physically above in the sky, something like that. Or as localized and as located physically above in the sky. So these are all a whole set of presuppositions, and there's certainly more. These are crucial ones. So now what about the noun heaven? Well, it means it can now be defined as something like a generally luminous space surrounding or near God when God is conceptualized as localized and as located above in the sky or beyond the sky, in which those human beings, the spirits of dead human beings, permanently abide. So it's permanently abide. Those human beings who are being rewarded for having followed God's precepts, something like that. And their reward is that they get all good and worthy, whatever things. And you have to have the word worthy in there too, instead of just good. So all of that is in the noun heaven. And if you go look at around the world's spiritual systems, you'll find that to the degree that they differ from this set of presuppositions, to that degree, you feel less comfortable using the word heaven in English. So let's take the concept of the afterlife in Greek mythology. It's often referred to as the Elysian Fields in ancient classical Greek belief. The Elysian Fields. Well, it's typically not called heaven. It's not called Greek heaven, ancient Greek heaven. It's typically called the Elysian Fields after them. Why? Because it differs enough from our set of presuppositions. For one thing, it's located on the ground, underneath the underground. It's not in the sky. Secondly, there's no deity in there. The deities are on Mount Olympus. Third, it's not for everybody, every good person's spirit. It's for the spirits of the heroic, of the heroes who died in battle especially. Next, they don't get all good and worthy experiences that will like improve their lives and in accordance with some system of values. Instead, they get all pleasant experiences. So they hunt, they banquet, they carouse, they don't simply improve the quality of their souls. And furthermore, they don't even have a single spirit that constitutes their identity, since Hercules was born of an immortal god or the other way around, I don't know, and an immortal mother, or one way or the other. Only the mortal portion of his spirit goes to the Elysian Fields. The immortal portion goes to Mount Olympus, a concept which would be totally alien in the West. So as you see, for these various reasons, you feel, English speakers would feel uncomfortable calling this heaven. Anyway, in terms of attention, the upshot is that, once again, the core meaning of the direct meaning of the noun heaven, this luminous space in which these people live, is more salient than all of these set of presuppositions, which in fact can be rather backgrounded and in fact rather difficult to tease out of your presuppositions and made explicit and fully conscious. In fact, it's often necessary it's so taken for granted that it's often necessary to encounter some other belief system to realize that they even are there. Okay, so that's it for this particular the frame properties of morphemes. So now we're shifting from a morpheme's individual components to where a single morpheme has a number of distinct senses. It's polysemous. It has a polysemous range, so it has a number of distinct senses, where each sense can arise within a particular context. It's called for, the context calls for a particular sense. So it turns out that the senses the distinct senses that a morpheme can have in its polysemous range can be weighted, ranked among themselves in their relative salience. Typically, any given morpheme will have, one of its senses will be the most highly weighted one, and will be the sense that pops into mind as you first hear the morpheme, unless the context makes it perfectly clear that some other one is called for. So let me take a particular concept which is in the polysemous range of 3 different morphemes. It doesn't exist there, but it exists in different rankings in those 3 morphemes. The concept that I want, the polysemous sense, is what I call is the material that plants grow in. Okay, that's the particulate material that plants grow in. That's the sense I want. Well, for the word soil, the noun soil, that's the most salient, that's the most heavily weighted of all of its senses, is that one. But it does have other senses within its polysemous range. It has the sense of, land. So like on my country that I live on. Or it also could be used to contrast country with urban settings. Like I live on the soil, meaning on the countryside. So it's got other meanings. But the first one is this stuff that plants grow in. The word dirt also has the stuff plants grow in as one of its senses, but now it's one of the less salient senses. The most salient sense of dirt is grime, yucky stuff, filthy stuff. That's the most salient sense. And in Earth, also the most salient sense is probably something like this planet. Another sense is the land mass, like it settled to Earth. Whereas one of its further senses could be the stuff that plants grow. So if you if you use these words in a non-constraining context, such as the X is slowly turning red, you say the soil is slowly turning red, the first thing that pops into your mind is the stuff plants growing. But if you say the dirt is slowly turning red, you think of grime, and the earth is slowly turning red, you think of the planet. Only if you've got a context like, I need to put more earth in my planter, or I need to put more dirt in my planter, that does the context automatically single out the relevant sense, even if it's further down the list. So the point here is, the attentional point is that there is a ranking, a weighting, among the different senses lying within a polysemous morphemes range. Okay, so here's another way in which the attentional factors work out. Right, so this is context affecting attention, and it's one of the star factors. And I've picked this one next because at least it keeps constant the theme of a polysemous range, each morpheme having a polysemous range. Well, here I'm going to directly deal with the fact that the context can single out just one of the polysemous available senses in a morpheme's polysemous range. And the attentional factor is that the contextually singled out sense is more salient than the other senses within the polysemous range of the morpheme, even more salient than the most highly weighted one. So I've listed a number of morphemes that have, and there are a number of senses for each of these morphemes. I've got the morpheme check. To check is a verb, and it means to ascertain, or to write a check mark beside, or to stop. It has a range of meanings. And market could mean open air fruit vendor location, or it could be a financial institution. Figure could refer to a set of numbers, or to a shape, or to an exalted personage, or to what else? Well, something else. And stock has a really large number of meanings. It means it can be a soup base, stored supplies, goes on and on. And down has a number of meanings. It could mean you're depressed. It could mean it's registered. It could mean downward, and so forth. So each of these has a whole range of meanings. But if you combine them in a particular context, typically the context, each of the co-presence of all the other morphemes in the context, together with the surrounding physical context, or the topic of the conversation in general, can quickly help the hearer narrow down to the sense within the polysemous range of each morpheme that is relevant. So, if you have a sentence like, I checked the market figures, my stock is down. Is that the sentence? Yeah, I checked the market figures, my stock is down. Well, the likeliest thing you would assume that this means is you're talking about the stock market, the financial things, and that the monetary value of your stock holdings is reduced in amount, and check means I went and looked at, and so forth. However, I found a way to develop a totally different context, which would then select for a completely different set of senses within the polysemous ranges. And that is, let's say I am the manager of a supermarket. So that already requires a different sense of market than stock market. And the home office every day prepares a set of figures, and these are then diagrams, not numbers, showing the, among other things, the current inventory in my supermarket, which is another way of saying that my stock. To check that if I find that these diagrams are correct, that they correspond to my actual inventory, I put a check mark beside them, and then my check mark is down. It means it's recorded, registered. Well, you could say the same sentence and refer to that. You could say, I checked the market figures, my stock is down. Meaning, in this case, it would mean my stock is down. So it could mean that given the right context. And the thing is, if you recontextualize something, all of a sudden there zips through your awareness of all these alternative meanings of these words, a different selection from each of the relevant sense within the Polysemous range. So now this process seems to involve, a way to look at it is that this process of the context foregrounding, selecting and foregrounding one of the polysemous senses of a morpheme is coupled with another process of inhibiting and therefore backgrounding the other senses of the morpheme. So it could be that there's two concurrent psychological processes going on. Once the context, through context, your cognitive processing determines that a particular sense within the polysemous range is the relevant one, and therefore needs to be foregrounded in favor of, at the cost of all the others, even the most highly weighted one. A comparable process then backgrounds all the rest of those concepts, inhibits them and keeps them down. Fine. Now maybe that's the actual psychological circumstance. However, it may be that certain concepts within the polysemous range have a life of their own, have a certain kind of extra energy to them to rise to attention, perhaps because they're taboo or significant or whatever, especially significant, and therefore they can sometimes break through the mask, the inhibition that is normally part of this process. Well, an example of this is if somebody says, here's an ashtray, somebody says, on a nice looking ashtray, on a nice table, and a host can say to a guest who's smoking, don't put your butt in that ashtray. Well, to an English speaker, this could be immediately funny, because but, the word but, B-U-T-T, has several senses. One of them is the stub end of a cigarette. Another is your rear end, your buttocks. So everything in the context should determine that the hearer would pick out just the stub concept of the word but, as meaning don't put your cigarette stub in that ashtray. But the buttocks sense of but can be so salient that it can break through the masking process, the inhibition process, and rise to attention, so that you now know, so to rival in attention, and therefore you get a pun and a joke. And in fact, I know that I'm not in an English-speaking audience because, a native-speaking English audience, because if you say this sentence to anybody, and to natives, you automatically get a round of chuckles through the audience. If you say, don't put your butt in that ashtray. Let's see, yeah. So, and there are several processes by which this inhibition system can be relaxed. So that, and there are two processes. One is poetry. In poetry, both the poet and the reader of the poetry deliberately, volitionally undergo a internal cognitive process whereby they relax their inhibitory system in order to allow the other senses, pellucidate senses of the morphemes to arise in order to enrich the semantics of the given words. Same goes for puns. When jokesters make puns, they depend on to this inhibition function in order to experience the subsidiary meanings of the morpheme. If somebody who doesn't get puns is typically unable or unwilling to relax this contextualizing suppression. So let's say, let me just, in order to do it, let me give a phonological factor. If I, in general, one of the main attentional factors that I have is that in hearing a morpheme, you typically, the meaning of the morpheme is typically more salient than the sound of the morpheme, than the phonological shape of the morpheme. That's a recurrent, but there is a way, there's another factor, this one, which can upset this factor. And that is, so let me give you two sentences. The first sentence is, it's no jest. Yeah, that's right. It's no jest. I talked to a chap who feared he'd gag on a Coke and die. Okay, no problem. We've got a sentence, a peculiar sentence, but a sentence. But now let me shift all these words to where they have the same rhyming ending. I can say, it's no joke. I spoke to a bloke who feared he'd choke on a Coke and croak. Okay, so this is now means the same thing. I've kept the rhythm the same and everything else. The words are the same register. But now I've made a set of words have the same phonological shape in their endings. It's called a rhyme. This mere fact alone draws attention to itself so that it attracts attention to the commonality of phonological shape across these separate words. And this can then overcome the sense of the usual factor, which is that the meaning of the morpheme is more salient than the sound of the morpheme. Since it's getting late, I think I'm going to go directly to section 3 and skip the and yeah, so this is now, what we've done so far is look at individual attentional factors. But typically, although those factors do have effects by themselves, and in fact, the basis for isolating these factors is because they can operate alone. Nevertheless, what they typically do is they cooperate with each other or compete with each other for larger attentional effects over the whole of a sentence or a portion of a sentence. So this is where I'm looking at certain of these effects, these combinatory effects. So first, the separate factors can combine in order to give you kind of a graduated effect of salience. So first, let's now look at the same passing of the goblet of wine around the table. If you now added a bunch of factors and a bunch of sentences, you would actually have a gradation of the concept of agency from strongest to weakest. So let's start with the sentence. The diners slowly passed the goblet of wine around the banquet table. Is that right? Yeah. Well, here the concept of agency is the strongest because we've got it expressed as the subject by a full noun as opposed to a a closed class form. In the beginning of the sentence, each of these things is a factor. With the use of a verb that selects for it as subject and so forth. Then we can reduce slightly the salience of the agency by converting it to a closed class form. So you can say, they slowly pass the goblet of wine around the table. Okay. Then you can reduce it further by turning it into the passive. The goblet of wine was slowly passed around the table by them. Here, by them, you use two factors to lower it. It's the factor that says that whatever appears first in the sentence is more salient. So if it's last, it's less salient. And if its subject is more salient, if it's not subject, it's less salient. So we've got both factors at work here. Then you've got, I can reduce it still further and say, the goblet of wine was slowly passed around the table. Delete mention of them at all. That's another factor which says that if some concept is explicitly mentioned, is present in the discourse, that concept is more salient than if it's not mentioned. It's another factor. Then you can shift it to the non-passive and say the goblet of wine slowly passed around the table instead of was passed. The was explicitly denotes, says that there's an agent there. In this case, the agency is solely part of the lexical meaning of intransitive to pass. And finally, you can go to the goblet of wine slowly went around the table where really there's no agency intrinsically expressed in the sentence at all. You have to infer it through pragmatics. Okay, so now we've gone through a whole list of how agency, because of the interaction of a number of factors, you can actually get a gradient. In addition, you can find that certain factors can coordinate their activities and appear together. So, in fact, languages often are so organized that they sort of conspire to allow certain factors to co-occur. So let's take the concept of, we just saw an example of it. The very first sentence in agency is, in fact, in a way that English lets you have set factors co-occur to extremely foreground agency. Foreground and highly, namely, it's subjecthood, first position, open class form, so forth, all these things together. Here's another example. So in other words, by allowing these set factors, all of which are referring to the attentional, to the salience of the same entity, you can either make that entity highly salient or highly non-salient. So consider the concept of a person. That concept of a person shows up either, it can show up as the noun person, is in the phrase a person who jogs, or it can show up as the suffix "er", as in a jogger. Both of them mean a person. But the first of these is highly salient because it represents the confluence of four different factors. One is it's a open class form instead of a closed class form, as opposed to "er". Second, it's phonologically longer. Third, it's stressed, more highly stressed. And fourth, it's a free form instead of a bound form. So all of these are factors that I listed earlier in the handout that we didn't go through them all, but here they are in action. As a consequence, the concept of personhood is more salient in person who jogs than in jogger. So these are ways in which different factors can reinforce each other in different degrees and give you gradients and or extreme high degrees of. But they can also conflict with each other. And in this case, you've got either, if they conflict, either one of them can outdo the others, or you can get competition. So in the first case, here, let me build it up this way. Let's take the concept of an airplane. The concept of an airplane is highly foregrounded in the sentence, I went to Key West last month by plane. And it's highly backgrounded in the sentence, I flew to Key West last month. But both of them mean I went there by plane. Okay. And the reason that it's highly foregrounded in the first one, it's one of these confluences of factors. Here it's the concept of an airplane is stressed because it's emphasized because one, it's more highly stressed than the flu. A flu is unstressed. It's a noun instead of a verb. It's at the end of a sentence instead of the middle of a sentence. And the concept in plane occupies the totality of the morpheme plane, whereas it's only a portion of the meaning of the morpheme to fly. There's more in fly than just airplane. There's also to go by airplane. Okay, so for those meanings. However, there's another factor which is involved with, which foregrounds anything that is under extra heavy stress. So you can say, I flew to Hawaii, I flew to Key West last month. If you stress it, you now undo the backgrounding of plane, of the concept of plane, and anyway, this extra heavy stress, it counterbands the backgrounding affected by all four of those factors together and forces the concept of airplane into the foreground of attention. So it does all that. Then there's a kind which is just competition and there's no clear winner. This is where, let's say, you have a limited attentional capacity and you have two different entities to devote it to, and there are two factors which want you to devote it to this or to that, and you have to switch between them. So for example, let's say you're listening to somebody talking along or you're listening to a play, and something has been said which is unclear. And then the person goes on and says something else. Well, one of the factors says you have to devote most attention to what's currently being said in order to process it immediately for its content, so as not to lose it at all. And therefore, that's what's current is more salient than what's past. But another factor says if something is unclear, devote enough attention to it to resolve it. Well, if somebody has said that something is unclear and here's the current thing, you've got two factors competing with each other, struggling for their share of your attentional resources. And you may go one way, or you may go the other way, or you may try to balance the two. So here are competing forces. My whole ultimate attentional system will include this kind of thing. Yeah, factors group under much larger concepts, which I only mentioned one here. The individual factors I have are really instances of much larger principles. So there's one principle which is the more significant something is, conceptually significant, or significant to the current context, the more salient it is. And there's a number of factors that really fall out of that one single overarching principle. So in the final analysis, I'm going to have a fewer set of principles. Many of the individual factors will fall out of as particular instantiations of it. And then there's contrasts with different systems as to which of the, who has all these different factors. Well, it turns out that, are they common to all languages, to all modalities, to all cognitive systems? The answer is no. So, for example, if you look at the factor which has to do with, there's one factor which we didn't go over, which is would affect topic markers. There's specialized markers which direct your attention to foregrounding some object that they're next to. So like topic markers. Well, Tamil has topic markers. Japanese has topic markers. Well, English doesn't. And so that particular factor goes pretty well unused by English. On the other hand, extra heavy stress to direct specialized attention to some element within a sentence, English uses enormously, whereas French very minimally. So there's an example of how this list of factors is used differentially by different languages. In addition, there's differences across language modalities between spoken language and sign language. Sign language has a kind of factor which it has no obvious counterpart among spoken languages. So namely, I'll show you how it works. This is the sign. What if you have a room and you want to move the wall further out to make the room more spacious? Well, if you indicate, this is the sign from that system I described last time, which classifier system for a large planar object. If you move it like this, that means that the wall physically went through the space to push it to this further point. But if you indicate it like this, that means that the wall was disassembled and reassembled at the further spot. Or either that, or you're not discussing. You're not interested in how it got to the further spot. So what's involved in doing that, this is essentially a disregard gesture. The disregard gesture says, disregard how this handshake first appears here and then gets to the second position. It's saying, don't worry about that. I can't think of a counterpart in spoken language to this disregard gesture. And another thing that sign language has is it has a way of maintaining through time a certain backgrounded entity. Well, it turns out that spoken language does do this for some things. Like English has it. Let's say if I express doubt, there's a doubt intonation pattern, which is a high pitch, constant pitch. So I can say in English, and I can therefore maintain over some portion of time the concept in a more backgrounded way, perhaps, the concept of my doubtingness. So I can say, are you really going to go through with that crazy plan of yours? And for the whole thing, you have this high pitch tone all the way through. Okay, well that indicates doubt all the way through. Well, that's an example of this phenomenon, but English cannot do this with a topic, whereas sign language can. So in ASL, I'm not going to be good at this, but in ASL, this is the sign for lunch. And if you want to say that lunch is free, but dinner you pay for, you sign the sign for lunch with your head raised and the eyebrows up, meaning I'm going to talk about lunch as a topic, as for lunch. And then you hold it out there, while with the right hand, you sign the word for free, which you're going to have to spell on something like this. And then, then you lower your eyes to show that you're now, but keep the concept of lunch out there. As for dinner, then you keep it out there. Lower your eyebrows to show that you're now doing the main event. It's free. Sorry, I did the other. No, you pay. You pay. So by holding this out there, you can show that it's either lunch that I'm talking about costing or dinner that I'm talking about being free. Whatever the other way around, free or paying. Okay, well, this is the way that sign language differs from spoken language. And finally, there's a contrast in attentional mechanisms between different cognitive systems. So spoken language and visual perception share certain mechanisms. So if something is along some dimension, is greater along some dimension, then it attracts more attention. So in English, for example, louder stress indicates that you're to direct more attention to the word, to the concept of the word that's being stressed. So more of something means more of some physical parameter means more attention to devote to it. And in visual perception, if something moves faster or is a lot brighter or larger, it typically attracts more attention than other things in the scene.
So that much is in common. But language has things which vision seems not to have very much of. So this very thing I mentioned of a topic marker, the whole notion of something next to another word which directs attention not to itself, but something next to it, nearby, is, I suspect, no vision psychologist, is relatively rare in visual perception. It's probably occurs maybe if you look at somebody themselves looking at something else, you might then take that as a sign to look over there to see what they're looking at. But typically visual arrays, maybe little within visual processing serves to say direct your attention over there. I'm not an expert. But if so, then there's a difference. Contrary-wise, visual perception seems to have something that's missing in spoken language. And that's quick transients. If something happens quickly, abruptly, it directs attention there. So if there's a sudden movement, you have the orienting response to move towards it, to look at it. And there's relatively little in language that works that way. There are some, like if you suddenly raise your voice and shout, yeah, sure, some people will look at you. But that seems to be almost part of the perceptual system. It doesn't seem to be a major part of the language system. So to summarize, we've got built into language a whole attentional system with a number of factors themselves coordinated that interact, that fall into larger groupings, all of which I'm planning to work out in some detail, to show that they are. In larger groupings, which should reveal the major attentional principles at work. This system, in part, is devoted, is in some respects specific to language, spoken language, and in some respects shares other features common with perception and other attention phenomena in our cognition in general.